And the folks indicated that. How long have you known Willie Nelson?
For decades, Kristofferson was untouchable, a songwriting genius, a Hollywood star, and one of the most respected voices in music history. Then suddenly, he faded from the spotlight. No scandals, no farewell tour, just silence. Fans noticed the change, the missed performances, the confusion in interviews. So what actually went wrong? And why did the industry stop talking about him altogether? The man who had it all before everything, Kristofferson, was widely regarded as one of the sharpest minds ever to enter popular music. His intelligence was not part of his image. It was the foundation of who he was. Born in 1936 into a military family, Kristofferson grew up in a world defined by discipline, structure, and high expectations. Excellence was assumed, not optional. That mindset carried him through his early education and set him apart long before fame entered the picture. Kristofferson's academic achievements were extraordinary. He attended Pomona College, where he excelled in literature and writing, then went on to Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar. At Oxford, he studied English literature and immersed himself in poetry, particularly the works of William Blake and other writers who explored human contradiction and moral struggle. This was not a phase or a curiosity. Writing was already central to his identity, even if music had not yet taken over his life. After returning to the United States, Kristofferson followed the path expected of him. He joined the U.S. Army, trained as a helicopter pilot, and rose to the rank of captain. He later became an instructor at West Point, one of the most prestigious military academies in the country. By any conventional measure, his future was secure and respected. He had intelligence, status, and a clear career trajectory that few would willingly abandon. Yet Kristofferson walked away from all of it. Against advice from family and peers, he left the military and moved to Nashville with little money and no guarantee of success. At the time, country music was dominated by traditional narratives and predictable structures. Kristofferson did not fit easily into that world. His songs were introspective, literate, and emotionally complex. They spoke about loneliness, failure, freedom, and regret in ways that felt uncomfortably honest. When artists like Janis Joplin, Johnny Cash, and Ray Price began recording his songs, it became clear that something had shifted. Me and Bobby McGee and Sunday Morning Comin' Down resonated not because they were catchy, but because they felt real. Kristofferson wrote from the perspective of flawed adults, rather than idealized characters. That approach helped redefine what country songwriting could be. His intelligence carried into his public persona. In interviews, Kristofferson was thoughtful and precise. He spoke slowly, often pausing to choose the right words, and rarely leaned on spectacle or ego. When he transitioned into acting, appearing in films like Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, and later A Star is Born, the same qualities remained. He projected calm, restraint, and emotional depth rather than bravado. The peak years and the pressure. By the early 70s, Kristofferson had reached a level of success few songwriters ever touch. His songs were not only hits, they were standards, recorded and re-recorded by some of the biggest names in music. With fame came opportunity, and with opportunity came relentless pressure. Kristofferson was suddenly everywhere, touring constantly, recording albums, appearing in films, and being pulled into a public life that moved far faster than the quiet, reflective world where his writing had begun. The pace was unforgiving. Touring schedules were intense, with little room for rest or recovery. Nights blurred into mornings, cities blurred into each other, and expectations never slowed. This was an era when burnout was rarely discussed and rarely addressed. Pushing through exhaustion was considered part of the job. Kristofferson, like many artists of his generation, absorbed that mindset without complaint. Alcohol also became part of that world. Kristofferson has spoken openly about his drinking during these years, not as a scandal, but as a coping mechanism common in the industry at the time. Long hours, constant travel, and the pressure to stay creatively sharp created an environment where excess was normalized. While it did not define him, it added strain to a body and mind already under constant demand. At the same time, his career was expanding beyond music. Acting brought new challenges, longer shoots, and different forms of stress. Films like Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia, and later, A Star is Born placed him under a different kind of scrutiny. Acting required emotional vulnerability on command, often layered on top of a schedule that left little space to. The workload was enormous, and it stretched across years, not months. Physically, the toll began to accumulate. Kristofferson endured injuries, chronic pain, and deep fatigue, issues he often pushed aside in order to keep working. Like many driven individuals, he prioritized output over preservation. There was no obvious breaking point, no single incident that signaled trouble. Instead, the damage built quietly, hidden behind success and productivity. What makes this period important is not that something visibly went wrong, but that nothing stopped. Kristofferson was admired for his work ethic and resilience, but those same traits masked how much strain he was under. By the time the peak years slowed, the cost had already been paid. Years of exhaustion, untreated physical issues, and constant pressure had left marks that were not immediately visible. When it started going wrong, the changes did not arrive suddenly, and that was part of what made them so difficult to understand. There was no collapse, no single moment that marked the beginning of Kristofferson's decline. Instead, the early signs appeared gradually, in ways that could easily be dismissed. A forgotten lyric during a live performance, a pause that lingered too long in an interview. At first, these moments were explained away as fatigue, distraction, or the natural effects of aging. But Kristofferson was not an ordinary performer. He was a writer whose strength came from language and memory. His songs were dense with meaning, carefully constructed, and deeply personal. Forgetting a line was not just a technical issue. It hinted at something more unsettling. Fans who had followed him for decades began to notice that these lapses were becoming more frequent. The mistakes were no longer rare. They were repeating. On stage, the shift was especially visible. Kristofferson sometimes struggled to complete verses of songs he had written and performed for most of his adult life. He would glance toward his band, searching for cues, or softly laugh off moments where the words simply would not come. There was no anger or embarrassment in his reaction, only a quiet awareness that something was not right. For audiences, these moments were uncomfortable to witness, not because he lacked talent, but because the struggle was so visible. Interviews told a similar story. Kristofferson remained gracious and thoughtful, but his answers often wandered. He lost his place mid-thought. Questions had to be repeated. At times, his responses seemed disconnected from what had been asked. The sharp, deliberate communicator people remembered was still there, but harder to reach. Each appearance added to a growing sense that this was more than simple forgetfulness. Privately, the situation was becoming harder to ignore. Kristofferson experienced increasing confusion in everyday settings. He struggled with short-term memory and concentration. Conversations repeated themselves. Directions were forgotten. These were not isolated incidents, but part of a pattern that was slowly tightening its grip. His family began seeking medical answers, hoping there was an explanation that made sense of the changes they were seeing. Public speculation followed. Some assumed alcohol had finally taken its toll. Others suggested dementia or Alzheimer's disease, pointing to the cognitive symptoms that seemed impossible to deny. Yet there was no clear statement, no official explanation offered at the time. The silence allowed assumptions to grow, and once those assumptions took hold, they were difficult to correct. Despite the mounting difficulties, Kristofferson continued to perform. Walking away from the stage was not an easy choice for him. Music had always been his anchor, and stepping back felt like surrender. His persistence was admired, but it also exposed him further. Each performance became a reminder that the man once defined by clarity was now battling uncertainty in public view. This period was defined by confusion more than tragedy. No one fully understood what was happening, including Kristofferson himself. The lack of answers was perhaps the hardest part. Something was clearly wrong, but it had no name yet. And in the absence of clarity, a narrative began to form, one that would soon be reinforced by a diagnosis that seemed to explain everything, even though it did not tell the whole truth. The Alzheimer's rumor. By the late 2000s and early 2010s, the lapses in memory and confusion that Kristofferson experienced began to be interpreted through a medical lens. The most immediate suspicion from those around him was Alzheimer's disease, or some form of dementia. It made sense on the surface. The symptoms matched what family, friends, and colleagues were observing. Forgetfulness, difficulty recalling words, occasional disorientation. These are hallmark signs of cognitive decline. For a man whose mind had always been his greatest instrument, the possibility was devastating. Kristofferson himself did not publicly dwell on these speculations, but privately, the concern was real. Family members began documenting behaviors, noting episodes where he struggled to remember basic information or repeated the same questions within minutes. Interviews and performances offered additional evidence. The man who once spoke with precision now occasionally stumbled over simple phrases. Those who had admired his intellect and wit could not help but notice the shift. The Alzheimer's narrative, while not confirmed at the time, quickly shaped public perception. It offered a framework to understand what had been difficult to explain otherwise. Audiences, journalists, and fans began to talk about Kristofferson differently, not just as a songwriter and actor, but as a figure struggling against a relentless, degenerative condition. This framing carried weight because Alzheimer's has a familiar story arc: brilliance, decline, and eventual loss of independence. Observers projected that storyline onto him, even as the full truth remained unknown. This period also impacted his career. Tours were scaled back, interviews became rarer, and his appearances were carefully managed. Directors and producers, aware of his cognitive struggles, adjusted schedules and dialogue for film projects. Kristofferson himself made deliberate choices to maintain dignity, stepping away from demanding commitments while still engaging with the work he loved whenever possible. Even as challenges mounted, he retained his commitment to his craft. Yet the Alzheimer's speculation was incomplete. While some symptoms aligned with cognitive disease, others did not. Kristofferson's memory lapses were inconsistent. At times, he could recall complex details or perform flawlessly, which was unusual for someone in the advanced stages of Alzheimer's. Friends and collaborators noticed fluctuations that suggested there might be an alternative explanation. But until the right diagnosis was made, the public story remained, framed by fear and assumption. This idea, the idea that Alzheimer's was the cause of his decline, would dominate conversations for years. It shaped how people viewed him, from stage performances to interviews, but it also obscured the real reason behind many of his struggles. The seeds of misunderstanding were planted here, creating a gap between perception and reality. And in that gap, Kristofferson's story began to feel both tragic and mysterious, leaving fans asking questions that would not be fully answered until much later. The Lyme disease discovery. For years, the public, and even those close to Kristofferson, believed that his cognitive struggles were tied to aging or Alzheimer's disease. It was an idea that seemed to fit, and for a long time there was little reason to question it. But the real story was far more complex, and it would take nearly a decade for the truth to emerge. Kristofferson was battling Lyme disease, a condition that had gone undiagnosed for years. Lyme disease, caused by a bacterial infection transmitted by ticks, can manifest in a wide range of symptoms. For Kristofferson, the most challenging were neurological. Memory loss, confusion, and difficulty concentrating had been interpreted as cognitive decline. Fatigue and muscle pain were seen as the toll of aging or the result of a demanding career. The overlap between Lyme symptoms and early dementia made the disease exceptionally difficult to identify, especially when doctors were unaware of potential exposure. The breakthrough came in 2016, after repeated consultations and specialized testing. His wife, Lisa Myers, revealed that the diagnosis finally made sense of years of misattributed struggles. The forgetfulness, the pauses in interviews, the difficulty recalling lyrics, All of it could be traced to a treatable infection, not an irreversible neurological decline. While it could not erase the years of strain or fully reverse some of the damage, it explained why a man who had once been so mentally sharp seemed to falter in ways that did not align with normal aging. Following treatment, there were reported improvements. Symptoms like extreme fatigue and muscle pain eased, and Kristofferson regained a degree of clarity in daily life. Yet the years of misdiagnosis had left an impact that could not be entirely undone. Memory lapses and cognitive struggles had been reinforced over time, and some effects were permanent. The truth was bittersweet. The disease was treatable, but its late diagnosis had allowed it to create complications that lingered. The Lyme disease revelation reshaped how both family and fans understood his decline. What had been assumed to be Alzheimer's or the inevitable result of aging was actually a complex medical condition with a concrete cause. It also shed light on why previous attempts to explain his difficulties had fallen short. Doctors, journalists, and observers had been seeing symptoms, but without the correct diagnosis. They could only speculate why the damage couldn't be fully reversed. Even after the Lyme disease diagnosis and subsequent treatment, it became clear that Kristofferson's journey would not return to the effortless brilliance of his earlier years. The late identification of the illness had allowed symptoms to accumulate over time, creating complications that could not simply be undone. Cognitive lapses, memory inconsistencies, and occasional disorientation persisted, illustrating that recovery is rarely absolute when a condition has been left untreated for years. Age was another limiting factor. By the time the diagnosis was confirmed, Kristofferson was already in his late 70s. The body's resilience declines naturally with age, and the brain is no exception. Even with proper treatment, neural pathways that had been affected could only partially recover. Some cognitive effects of the disease had been reinforced through years of compensating for memory loss, making the process of regaining prior clarity slower and incomplete. Kristofferson also faced other health challenges that complicated recovery. Chronic fatigue and musculoskeletal pain, lingering from both Lyme disease and decades of physical strain from touring and performing, continued to affect his daily life. Earlier cardiac issues, including a coronary bypass in 1999, had left their mark. Sleep apnea further disrupted rest and recovery, exacerbating cognitive and physical fatigue. Each of these factors alone might have been manageable, but together they created a web of challenges that limited how fully he could bounce back. Additionally, the psychological toll of years of misdiagnosis should not be underestimated. Believing for a long time that one is facing Alzheimer's can create fear, anxiety, and stress, which in turn affect cognitive performance. The weight of public perception, the subtle expectation that a man of his intellect and talent should perform as always, added further pressure. Recovery in this sense was not just biological but also emotional, and some effects were inevitably enduring. Despite these limitations, Kristofferson displayed remarkable resilience. He continued to engage with music, performing selectively and taking part in events that were meaningful to him. While he was no longer at the relentless pace of his peak years, he found ways to remain creatively active and connected to audiences. The difference was clear. The effortless command of his earlier work had given way to careful planning, deliberate pacing, and a focus on what he could still do rather than what he had lost. This period highlights a crucial truth about illness and aging, particularly in high-performance individuals. Diagnosis and treatment, no matter how effective, cannot always erase years of accumulated strain. Recovery is a process of adaptation as much as restoration. For Kristofferson, Lyme disease treatment brought clarity and relief, but the years of unrecognized symptoms had left permanent traces. Understanding this helps to reconcile what fans observed in his later years with the reality of his life and health. Stepping away from the spotlight. Stepping away from the spotlight. As Kristofferson entered his later years, it became clear that the life he had once led, relentless touring, non-stop recording, and constant public appearances, was no longer sustainable. The combination of age, lingering effects of Lyme disease, and years of accumulated physical strain meant that he had to make deliberate choices about how to spend his time. Stepping back from the spotlight was not a surrender. It was a conscious effort to preserve dignity, health, and the joy he still found in music. By the mid-2010s, his public appearances became increasingly selective. Rather than constant tours, he focused on performances that had personal significance, or that allowed him to collaborate with friends and fellow musicians. These were not full-scale productions, but carefully curated moments that balanced audience expectation with his own capabilities. Fans who attended noticed a quieter stage presence, less energy spent on theatrics, and more emphasis on storytelling and connection. It was in many ways a return to the core of what had made him compelling in the first place: honesty and intimacy. His final performances demonstrated a mixture of vulnerability and resilience. Kristofferson sometimes struggled with lyrics or timing, yet he carried himself with calm and grace. Rather than hiding imperfections, he met them with a wry smile or understated acknowledgement. Those who witnessed these performances often described them as moving, not because they showcased perfection, but because they revealed a man confronting human limitations while remaining fully engaged in the craft he loved. Off stage, life had shifted toward privacy. He spent more time with his wife, family, and close friends. Public appearances became rare, interviews selective. This retreat was not about isolation, but about control, about choosing how to engage with the world on his own terms. By reducing the external pressures that had defined his earlier career, Kristofferson was able to focus on what mattered most: music, reflection, and meaningful connections. At the same time, the public speculation began to simplify. Where once his genius was unquestioned, observers increasingly framed him through the lens of decline. Social media and occasional reports highlighted the moments when he faltered, sometimes forgetting lyrics or stumbling over interviews. But those closest to him understood that these instances did not define his life or career. They were merely one facet of a man adapting to a new reality. Kristofferson's withdrawal from the limelight also highlighted a rare form of courage. It takes humility to acknowledge limitations, particularly for someone whose identity has been so publicly tied to talent and intellect. Choosing quality over quantity, depth over visibility, he preserved his dignity while still leaving an impression on those who mattered. In doing so, he demonstrated that stepping away can be as powerful a statement as stepping forward, a testament to a life lived on one's own terms. His final years in passing. In the final chapter of Kris Kristofferson's life, the rhythm slowed, and the public began to see a different side of the man who had once seemed unstoppable. After decades of touring, recording, and acting, he had largely stepped away from the stage. Living in Maui with his wife, Lisa Myers, Kristofferson embraced a quieter life, focused on family, reflection, and the small joys that had always balanced the intensity of his career. Despite his earlier health struggles, he remained engaged with music when he could. He participated in select tribute events and collaborated with longtime friends, including Willie Nelson, on projects that were meaningful rather than obligatory. These appearances were measured and intentional. They highlighted a man who, even when confronted with physical and cognitive challenges, refused to abandon the craft that had defined him. The public witnessed a mixture of vulnerability and strength. Kristofferson's health continued to require careful management, but those close to him observed that he retained his wit, insight, and emotional depth. He no longer moved through life at the breakneck pace of his younger years, yet he was fully present in the moments that mattered most. Family and friends became central, offering both support and a sense of purpose in his later years. On September 28, 2024, Kris Kristofferson passed away peacefully at the age of 88 at his home in Maui. His family confirmed the news but chose not to disclose a specific cause of death. The decision reflected the same privacy and dignity that had characterized his later life. Reaction from the public and the music community was immediate and heartfelt. Fellow musicians, actors, and fans expressed admiration and sorrow, highlighting his contributions to music, film, and culture. Tributes emphasized his lasting impact as a songwriter whose words continue to resonate, and as an actor whose performances conveyed subtle emotional truths. Many reflected on how he had navigated life with integrity, even when faced with health struggles that few outside his inner circle fully understood. Kristofferson's passing underscored the fragility of life even for those who seem larger than it. Yet it also reinforced the resilience he displayed throughout his life. His final years, though quieter and more private, were not defined by illness alone. They were marked by reflection, connection, and the enduring presence of the art that had given his life meaning. Ultimately, Kristofferson left the world as he had lived in it, on his own terms, with honesty, thoughtfulness, and a quiet dignity that outlasted both fame and struggle. What really happened to Kristofferson? After decades of brilliance, fame, and relentless creativity, Kristofferson's later years were marked by challenges that the public often misunderstood. For many, the speculation seemed simple: a legendary musician and actor experiencing mental decline, possibly Alzheimer's. But the reality was far more complex, nuanced, and rooted in both biology and circumstance. The first layer of misunderstanding came. To outside observers, these lapses suggested irreversible cognitive decline, consistent with dementia or Alzheimer's disease. This interpretation dominated discussions for years, shaping public perception of his final decades. Yet those closest to him understood that something else was at play. The true explanation emerged with his Lyme disease diagnosis in 2016. Untreated for years, the infection caused neurological and physical symptoms that mimic dementia: memory lapses, confusion, fatigue, and muscle pain. The late identification of the disease meant that Kristofferson had endured years of unexplained symptoms, leading to speculation and misinterpretation. Treatment brought improvement, but the long-term effects and years of accumulated strain could not be entirely reversed. Age was another critical factor. By the time the correct diagnosis was made, Kristofferson was in his late 70s. Natural aging, combined with years of high-pressure work, touring, and performing, created limitations that no medical intervention could fully erase. Chronic pain, fatigue, and previous health issues, including heart surgery and sleep apnea, further complicated his recovery. The picture was not one of sudden collapse, but of gradual, layered decline, a process both medical and natural. Importantly, what happened to Kristofferson was not a failure of will, talent, or intellect. He adapted, stepped back when necessary, and continued to engage with the things he loved: music, family, and meaningful collaborations. His perseverance in the face of health challenges demonstrated resilience rather than weakness. The public, however, often saw only fragments: a forgotten lyric, a halting interview, a brief stumble on stage. Those fragments, amplified and repeated, created a skewed narrative. Ultimately, what happened to Kristofferson was the convergence of treatable illness, misdiagnosis, accumulated physical strain, and natural aging. His story reminds us that even the most intelligent, disciplined, and talented individuals are vulnerable to health challenges, and that public perception rarely captures the full truth. Behind the visible struggles was a man who continued to live with intention, creativity, and dignity until the very end. The legacy beyond the decline. Kristofferson's story is often framed around his struggles in later years, but to focus only on decline is to overlook a legacy that reshaped music, film, and culture. His contributions as a songwriter alone are monumental. He redefined what country music could be, infusing it with literary depth, emotional honesty, and a willingness to confront human imperfection. Songs like Me and Bobby McGee and Sunday Morning Comin' Down remain timeless because they speak to universal experiences: loss, love, freedom, and regret, with unmatched clarity and poetry. As an actor, Kristofferson brought nuance and gravitas to every role. From Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid to A Star is Born, his performances conveyed emotional complexity rarely seen in mainstream cinema. He had the ability to inhabit flawed, deeply human characters without resorting to melodrama, leaving a lasting impression on both audiences and fellow performers. His work demonstrated that authenticity and subtlety could be as powerful as spectacle in storytelling. Beyond the artistic achievements, Kristofferson's life offers lessons about resilience, courage, and adaptability. Even after years of misdiagnosis and health struggles, he continued to create, perform, and connect with those around him. He accepted limitations without surrendering to them, choosing to focus on what he could do rather than mourning what he had lost. In that, he modeled a quiet strength that is rarely celebrated in public narratives. His influence stretches across generations. Songwriters, musicians, and actors alike cite him as a source of inspiration, not just for his skill, but for his integrity and willingness to follow his own path. In a world obsessed with constant visibility and rapid success, Kristofferson's career reminds us that longevity, depth, and authenticity matter. He left behind a body of work that continues to resonate, a standard of artistry that will endure long after his passing. Beyond his professional achievements, Kristofferson's life serves as a testament to the power of perseverance and self-determination. He navigated immense pressures, personal struggles, and public scrutiny without compromising his principles or creative vision. His choices to prioritize artistry over fleeting trends, to embrace vulnerability in his music and performances, and to confront challenges with quiet resilience offer lessons that extend far beyond the entertainment industry. Ultimately, the story of Kris Kristofferson is not defined by health struggles or public speculation. It is defined by a life lived fully, by work that continues to touch hearts, and by a resilience that turned challenges into quiet victories. His legacy is a reminder that brilliance, creativity, and human dignity can endure even when the spotlight fades. In the end, Kris Kristofferson remains unforgettable, not because of his decline, but because of everything he accomplished and the way he lived.